Thanks very much. My wife and I have been here for 5-6 days, and we've been shown an incredible time. I know the other speakers here have experienced the same thing, such hospitality. We're grateful to the whole team here that you've assembled. So we've really enjoyed ourselves, our first visit to Istanbul, and hope to come here many more times. So the title of the talk is a little different because I've shrunk it a little bit to focus on just part of a larger project. I'm calling it Necessary Answers to the Big Question, and I hope that'll make sense here in a second. So the big question is, why is there something rather than nothing? And that's a question that hasn't gone away. It still receives a lot of attention. You've got books like these that have come out in the last 10 years or so that have considered the question, why is there something rather than nothing? But of course, it's a really old question. These are the recent books. These are some older books. Every major philosopher in the modern or medieval period has had something to say about it. David Hume, Samuel Clarke, Thomas Aquinas, of course, and Anselm. And the classical Islamic philosophers were also concerned with this question, and several of them, including here Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Al-Ghazali, gave answers that greatly influenced the subsequent discussions, and we're going to bump into some principles from Avicenna. But these historical figures usually assumed, or many of them assumed, something like a principle of sufficient reason. So sometimes this would take the form of, for any truth, or any truth about what exists, or any truth about interesting matters of fact, there has to be some kind of story that explains its truth. In other words, there are no brute facts. And by assuming that kind of principle and then asking, well, what explains why there is anything, you can develop an argument, a cosmological argument for the existence of a necessary being that explains everything else. And Dr. Abdul Hussein Kushrapana this morning, I'm losing track, my sense of time is poor, but this morning gave us a kind of cosmological argument that depended upon something like the principle of sufficient reason. If something exists, but it possibly didn't exist, well, then there has to be an explanation, and you can't just keep appealing to more merely possible things. You're going to end up with a necessary being. And I'm not here to throw cold water on that sort of argument. I'm not here to say that that sort of argument is not actually sound, okay? But it does depend upon a very strong principle, and many people nowadays in philosophy would reject this principle, and then it's hard to get that sort of argument going. However, I think that doesn't mean that the question, why do we find things that exist here? It doesn't mean that question can't be used to support the existence of a necessary being that explains everything else. It can still be used to support that, but in a slightly different and, I'm afraid, weaker sort of way, because even people who reject a principle of sufficient reason will often accept a kind of principle about the theoretical preferability of a theory that can answer more questions. So, although I'm not going to assume the principle of sufficient reason, I'll assume this principle. For any question that seems like it could have an answer, a theory is better than it would otherwise be, that is more believable, more plausible, if it can tell a story that answers the question. So a person's worldview is better, at least prima facie better, to the extent that it explains facts that seem susceptible of explanation. Now, this is definitely an other things being equal kind of principle. So there can be stories that would explain a fact, were they true, but they're really totally implausible, right? Or we know that they're false. But other things being equal, a theory that can explain a question that seems like it deserves an answer gets an epistemic boost. In other words, it gets a plus sign. When you're sort of writing down, what does it have going for it? It gets a plus if it can answer a question that another theory can't. Okay, so what are good answers to questions like, why does this exist? Why does that exist? Well, I don't have much to say about this. Explanation, understanding, these are very complicated concepts, and people work on them, and I don't work very hard on them. But they are some kind of story that explains why the thing had to exist, or at least why it was very likely to exist. So an answer to the question of why does something exist rather than nothing would be a story that explained why something or other had to exist, or why it was very likely that something or other would exist. You might give an answer to this question that didn't have an explanation of why anything in particular existed, but why there had to be something or other. We'll see some answers like that shortly. Okay, and I'm going to focus on just one facet of what there is. When you're asking, why does something exist rather than nothing, you could be asking, why is there anything at all of any kind whatsoever? I'm going to focus just on what I'm going to call interesting things. So some people, some philosophers, think even if there were no cosmos, no space and time, even if there were no souls, even if there were no God, there would still be these necessarily existing things like numbers or sets, including the empty set, and the set that includes just the empty set, and so on. Some philosophers believe in propositions or properties that would have existed no matter what. These are things that, maybe they're things only philosophers could love, but they're things that don't really do anything. They exist in Plato's heaven. The reason you believe that they exist necessarily is because you think to yourself, well, even if there wasn't anything else, 2 + 2 would still be 4, and so there would have to be numbers. Well, even if there was nothing else but just numbers, what would happen? Nothing would happen. There'd just be numbers. Numbers don't cause anything. They just sit there for us to contemplate. So I'm going to say things that don't cause other things are too boring. We're not interested in them. Let's just think about interesting things and ask, why are there any interesting things? Because obviously there are. I can cause things to happen. If there's a God, God causes things to happen, and so on. So these interesting things exist. Why are there any interesting things at all? Now, to think about the kinds of stories we could tell to answer that question, I'm going to need to make a bunch of distinctions. So here's the analytic philosophy part of the show, where I make a bunch of distinctions that might not be obviously important, but hopefully will turn out to be important. Some distinctions are distinctions having to do with necessity and contingency. So some truths are necessarily true. They would have been true no matter what. We say they're true in every possible world, true however things could have been. And some philosophers have tried to tell stories that explain the existence of something rather than nothing in terms just of necessary truths. They The stories themselves purport to be necessary. They have to be the case. And they explain why interesting things exist. That'll be my focus today because I had to choose some particular kinds of explanation, and that's what I'm going to focus on. Other stories have been offered that involve contingencies. So truths are merely contingently true if they didn't have to be true. They're just true in some possible worlds, but false in other possible worlds. Stories that explain the existence of something interesting at all that are merely contingent have been kind of popular lately, and I'll gesture at a couple of them. But traditionally, they've been thought to be failures, that you can't explain the existence of something interesting in terms merely of contingent, in terms of stories that appeal to contingency. Also, there's an important distinction between things that are necessary and things that are contingent. That is, things that exist necessarily. So if something exists necessarily, it's a necessary truth that it exists. It's in every possible world. It would exist no matter what. Contingent things aren't like that. It's merely contingently true that those things exist, and some possible worlds lack them. Okay, so presumably I'm merely contingent. I did not have to exist. Some answers to the question of why is there anything interesting at all are questions that are, whoops, I'm losing control of my slides here. Let me find my pointer. Where is the thing? There it is. Oh, darn. Okay, I cannot control this very well, but I'll do my best. Okay, some stories posit necessary things. Others say, well, there are no necessary things, but something or other contingent had to exist. Okay. Another set of distinctions that will be important, and this is just a matter of how we use terms. Are we going to use cosmos, universe, multiverse to refer to this or that, or what? So the interesting things that in fact exist include at least our cosmos. And by that I mean you, me, this stuff, and anything you can get to by going backward or forward in space and time. Or anything causally related to any of this stuff. I'll refer to all that as our cosmos. Okay. Now, some theories about what exists say that there's a multiverse, but you can mean different things by a multiverse. So in the comic book universe of DC, anyway, the Detective Comics, there's a multiverse. But it's one where, on one planet you've got Superman only, on another planet you've got Shazam and Superman both existing, on a third one you've got just Shazam, or Captain Marvel, and no Superman. Why? Well, because the comic books were inconsistent, and so they had to come up with, some explanation. So they just introduced different universes and said, well, on one of them, Superman and Shazam both exist, and so on. Well, this isn't what I'm going to mean by a multiverse. It's what I would call a single cosmos, because they're all connected. Okay? You can pass from one to another. You can be somehow between them and observing them. These guys are observing these parallel Earths emerging because there was a cataclysmic event. Don't ask me. It doesn't make any sense. But the DC multiverse, I'm going to say, well, that's a single cosmos because they're all connected. These guys are saying that they're connected at the origin and they're branching out. A real multiverse requires more than one cosmos. Disconnected cosmoi, I guess that's the plural. So you've got our universe, all the stuff that is in our past and future that you could affect from where we are. if we inhabit a multiverse, there are other universes as well that you can't get to from here. They can't affect us, we can't affect them. They're not in our past or in our future. If there's a multiverse, there are island universes. There's this cosmos, and then that other one, and so on. Okay. A possible world is a complete way that everything could be. It's like a book containing all the things that would be true. And if a multiverse is possible, then some possible world contains more than one cosmos. The possible world says there's one cosmos over here, and then there's another one that's disconnected from it. So if our world is not a multiverse, if in fact the actual truth about things is there's just one cosmos, then we don't live in a multiverse. Okay, a possible world is a more abstract thing. It's sort of like a way that things could be, but they might not be. When we use the word universe, or when I use it, that might be sort of unclear. You might think it means cosmos. But what I will mean by universe is the sum total of all that exists, whether there's just a single cosmos or many. Now, there's one possible world that's going to be important for our story. That is the null world. The null world also sounds like a science fiction concept, but it's just the idea of the possible world in which there are no interesting things whatsoever, whether contingent or necessary. So the question that we're trying to answer is, why are there any interesting things at all? Can we answer that question? What are the possible answers that you could try to give? Another way to put that question is, why not the null world? Why was the null world not the case? So why are there interesting things? This is part of a larger project, which is to sort of canvass responses to the question. Now, some people respond to the question by saying, it's meaningless. That would be, for instance, Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein was kind of a bully, and he would try to bully people into thinking that the question is meaningless by saying, you don't understand the words that you're saying. And, well, okay, we shouldn't be bullied. We understand the words. Okay, maybe there's no answer, but we understand the words. It's not meaningless. Some people say, there's no answer, and if there's no answer, then we shouldn't bother with the question. Well, okay, if there's no answer, that's a way of saying there is no reason why something exists rather than nothing. Okay? Maybe that's right. Maybe it's just a brute fact. However, given that principle about theoretical preferability, if a theory or a worldview has an answer to the question, and it's not crazy, well, that shows that that theory gets a plus. So it's worth thinking about the question. Even if it is a brute fact at the end of the day, it's worth thinking about because theories that provide an answer do deserve an epistemic boost. They deserve a plus in the plausibility column. So that's not a good reason to not think about the question. Now, as I said, recently some people have tried to provide contingent stories that answer the question. In Hume's day, Hume suggested that we could have a contingent story that answered the question, David Hume, by just supposing that everything is caused by some earlier thing, and that goes on forever, and therefore all is explained. Because, says Hume, if every particular thing is explained, then you've explained why they all exist. Now, Avicenna would never have bought that. He had a principle we're going to get to that denies that. Samuel Clarke, before Hume wrote his dialogues, argued that that would not be a good answer, and I think it isn't a good answer, because you can still ask, why do all those things exist, even if each one is explained by another member of the series? More recently, Lawrence Krauss and Stephen Hawking have tried to provide contingent explanations of why this cosmos exists, or why the universe, the physical universe exists, by appeal to a kind of law that says probably universes are going to pop into existence. I'm not going to talk about that. Maybe we can talk about it in the Q&A if I can get through this in time. But David Albert, I think, has given a perfectly good response to this. That's not how laws work. Laws tell you how stuff can be arranged in a physical world. Laws tell you how stuff can generate new stuff. A law that doesn't do that, that just says stuff is likely, that's not the way laws operate. So I think these recent attempts to tell contingent stories in terms of a contingent law, it's just the laws of quantum mechanics say it's probable that there's a universe. That's one way that Krauss and Hawking describe what they're doing. This is not a genuine sort of explanation, because it gives laws a job that they just can't play. Okay, so I'm going to give up on contingent stories and only consider necessary stories. And we'll, of course, we'll wind up with a necessary story that is very familiar. But let's, the familiar story being one necessary being exists that's really interesting, because this being can cause everything else. But there are other kinds of necessary stories besides that one. And if they're good, they too deserve a boost, an epistemic plus. They've answered a question that seems like it deserves an answer. So let's think about some necessary stories that just appeal to contingent things. So there's 4A here, necessary stories that are only about contingent things, that say there aren't any things that are really necessary in themselves, no individual things, just lots of contingent things. I know of two kinds. The first is, necessarily, it was likely that something or other interesting would exist, but there's no particular thing that had to exist. The other sort of story is, necessarily, something or other exists, but no particular thing. So Earl Coney has given us a reason to accept this first kind. Coney suggests a reason, a kind of a priori reason, to think it was likely that something or other exists. He says, think about the null world, the world where there's no interesting contingent things at all. That, if there's no necessarily existing interesting things, that world would just have boring things. Numbers, propositions, I don't know, abstract things. And there's only one way for those things to be, so there's only one null world. Meanwhile, the range of worlds with contingent things is infinite. There's infinitely many ways that there could have been interesting things. So he says, with just one null world, the odds are in favor of all the others. It's a very interesting idea, and it does seem like it provides a kind of probabilistic explanation of why there's anything at all, without supposing that there's any particular interesting thing that's necessary. Now, there's all sorts of objections you could raise to this, and how much time do I have left, dear moderator?
10 minutes plus 5 minutes for questions. If
10
possible.
minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm not going to talk about it. I'll let you puzzle over that. I think there's things that can be said against it, so we'll cross it out, but leave some question marks. Okay. Necessarily something or other exists, but there are no necessary things. Is this a plausible thing to believe? Could you attach this to the other things you believe and have a theory or a worldview that makes sense? In other words, could you just deny that the null world is really possible, but say there are no necessarily existing things? I think this is not a very plausible story to tell. The reason is that contingent things should be subtractable. If you've got a number of contingent things, you should be able to describe a possible world that simply deletes any one of them without adding more things, at least if they are discrete. They're separate from one another. They're not connected to one another. So if that's right, then if there's a world with a finite number of contingent things, and why not, then by successive subtraction, you should get to a world, a possible world, with no contingent things. Two philosophers, Effred and Stoneham, have written a very nice paper defending this sort of argument, as have some other philosophers. It's an ongoing debate whether this is a good argument. So if you just Google subtractability, contingency, you'll get this series of articles. But I think this is a good reason to think that the null world is possible if all there are contingent things. So if there are no interesting necessary beings, the possible world with no contingent things is just the null world. And then if the null world is possible, this necessary story is false. So that leaves us then with just necessary stories about necessary things. This doesn't get us all the way to God right away, or all the way to a greatest possible being that caused everything else, because some necessary stories have been about other things. Now, if we're going to tell a necessary story about necessary things, they have to be necessarily existing interesting things, because that's the question we're asking. Things that can cause other things. Also, if this is going to be an explanation that tells us why the thing is true at all, why it's true at all that there are necessary things, or that there are rather interesting things, the story has to be about things that are not merely derivatively necessary, because those things have further explanations as to why they exist. Here's what I mean by derivatively necessary things. So if you've got a bunch of necessary things, say the numbers 1 through 10, maybe they just exist necessarily, period. But you've also got the set that includes 1 through 10. That set is not a number. It's a set of numbers. But presumably it exists necessarily if they do. But it's derivative because it only exists because they're around to form a set. Another example would be if God is a necessary being and God necessarily has a certain thought. Maybe God knows that 2 + 2 = 4. Well, if God is a necessary being and necessarily thinks that thought necessarily exists, but presumably it's derivative. It only exists because God exists and is necessary. So I think there have to be non-derivatively necessary things if there are derivatively necessary things, because there couldn't be necessarily existing things that depend upon merely derivatively necessary things, that depend upon merely derivatively necessary things, and so on forever. I'm not sure that there couldn't be a causal series that goes on forever like that, but this is worse, because a merely derivatively necessarily existing thing depends for its existence upon something else being a certain way. So that thing has to exist, and so on. So the whole series has to bottom out, I think. Okay, let's suppose you buy that anyway. In that case, you have to have non-derivatively necessary things, and they do explain their own existence. Why? Because it's in the nature of the thing to exist. It doesn't get its necessary existence from something else, but from itself. So it's in its nature to be so-and-so. If it's in the nature of a thing to be so-and-so, then to understand the nature is to understand why it is so-and-so. And if it's in the nature of a thing to exist, then if you really understood the nature of the thing, you'd see why it has to exist. Such things would be self-existent. Okay. Now, as William James said, some things seem more like better candidates for necessarily existing things than others. So what kinds of things could be necessarily existing, interesting things? Here's a test, a kind of non-arbitrariness test that I think we use when we're doing philosophy and asking whether this or that kind of thing exists necessarily. If something, X, belongs to a family of very similar, seemingly possible objects, then X can be necessarily existing and the rest of the family not, only if X is strikingly different from the others in some way. Otherwise, they should all be necessary or none. And I think we use that, philosophers of mathematics use it. Some say the only self-existent numbers are the integers, and others say, no, all numbers are self-existent. But nobody ever says, well, number 1 and number 2 are self-existent, and we construct all the others from 1 and 2, or 1 and 2 and 7. That's crazy. All right, well, let's use that test when we're thinking about two very popular strategies. Maybe this is exhaustive, these strategies, for finding a necessary being that is interesting. Strategy 1, posit a necessary being that is constituted by some or all of the stuff in our cosmos or stuff like it. Strategy 2, posit at least one interesting necessary being that is not made out of the physical stuff in our cosmos or stuff like it. The subtractability argument from the contingency of all the parts of the universe to the possibility of the null world, that constrains the options here. It vindicates a principle that Avicenna appeals to in a very similar context. If a whole is necessary, but each of its units is contingent, then the necessary would be composed of contingents, which is absurd. So if the universe were composed without remainder of contingent parts, the null world would be possible. And then the universe as a whole would not exist necessarily. That requires that for strategy 1 to work, at least some parts of the universe, some actual actually existing physical stuff has to be necessary. But what could that be? It's got to be, it can't be just like all the other parts or a bunch of other things in the world. It has to be special. So you couldn't pick just the universe up until 1965, even though, to me, that's a very important year, right? It's when I was born. But you couldn't say everything before 1965 was necessary and everything since then is contingent. If you're going to say a big chunk of the universe is necessary, it's got to be an interesting chunk. So you might say all and only the things that actually exist are necessary. Or you might say all and only the fundamental particles that actually exist are necessary. Or there's an initial state. It's very special because it's the first, and its constituents are necessary. Let's try that first one. All and only the things that actually exist are necessary. But how big is our universe? If it's really just our solitary cosmos, then this would be like Spinoza's idea, that every little detail of our cosmos is necessary. All appearance of contingency is a sham. That's very implausible, so we should reject that one. There are some popular versions of this kind of strategy today that avoid Spinoza's extreme conclusion. John Leslie says all the good cosmoi exist. There's a multiverse with all of those. So it's not just this stuff. Still, why not the bad ones? It seems a bit odd. David Lewis maybe had the most plausible, but also the most implausible version of this view. Every possible universe that we can imagine exists. And the biggest world does seem like a pretty good candidate for a necessarily existing thing. Now, he said he didn't want to say it was necessary, but he certainly didn't think it was contingent, this gigantic multiverse. I'm skeptical of these kinds of view because, in a way, they say the universe is, in all of its details, necessary, and that seems implausible. So I think when we look closely at this first strategy, it is going to turn out to be less good than strategy 2. Posit at least one interesting necessary being that is not made out of the physical stuff in our cosmos or stuff like it. But what are the candidates for that? Well, whatever we propose, it should be strikingly different from other seemingly possible candidates. And the traditional characters now appear. The greatest possible being. That's a very unique and striking thing. If there is such a possibility, if there's such a possible being, it would be a good candidate. Now, of course, the worst possible being is also kind of special. So a very negative person might think that's the necessarily existing being. Or a kind of dualist might believe the best and the worst possible beings are both necessary, and we're sort of stuck here in the battleground. The greatest possible rational agent, if that's something different from the greatest possible being, that also is a good candidate. I think the greatest possible being is a coherent notion, and of course St. Anselm is famous for positing this as the cause of everything else. But that's not, that idea is not dead, as many of you know. Analytic philosophers continue, a few, to defend this idea. That's Charles Hartshorne, that's Norman Malcolm, that's my dear friend Al Plantinga. So it's an idea that's still very much alive. Given the failure of contingency stories and the unlikelihood of the necessary stories that appeal to things that are just made out of stuff like our cosmos is made out of, this looks like a good answer if there is a good answer. And so I think stories that appeal to such a being deserve a plus in their column. Now that's not a knockdown argument that appeals to the principle of sufficient reason, but maybe it still gets us some ways in the direction of that character there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can answer a few questions, but arkadaşlar biliyorsunuz bir sonraki oturumumuz yine 3 tane konuğumuzun sunumlarıyla devam edecek. Fakat yani bir yarım saat çay ve kahve molası vereceğiz. Öncesinde birkaç soruyu cevaplayalım. Sonrasında kahve çay molasına çıkalım. Yarım saat. Evet, soruları alabiliriz. Hocam buyurunuz.
So, thanks for the presentation. I have a question which relates to what you said and what Scott said. If you assign a value for necessary things, obviously they should be positive. So what about the worst ones? Are they negative? Because I don't remember Scott having negative values. It was all positive. So, and would that create any problem for the problem of evil?
I'm sorry, you said what if...
so the worst beings
the
are
worst...
probably the last thing that you said, probably would have to be assigned negative values. If there are negative values, what happens to the story of the problem of evil?
So
Scott described.
Is the question, if there is something that has negative value,
or in general, how would you connect necessary beings and the value theory that Scott explained?
Okay. Let's see. If you think, I mean, you might think that, like John Leslie, that there's a kind of a bias in favor of good things, things that have positive intrinsic value, and that they tend to exist without the need for any interesting being causing them to exist. That's Leslie's view. I think maybe he thinks it's necessarily true. I think that if you believe in a greatest possible being who is able to, cause things and has a kind of is itself intrinsically good, you should be surprised when there are things that don't seem to be intrinsically good. And so that gives you a problem of evil for any such view. I see Scott's point that maybe the value of all the intrinsic, if you ascribe intrinsic value to all sorts of things that normally we would have thought were neutral, that might help with the problem of evil. But I do think that, moral good and bad outweigh, I don't know, I'm kind of inclined to think of the intrinsic value that's being ascribed to rocks as kind of like aesthetic value, and it should just get outweighed by other kinds of by suffering, for instance. But maybe I'm not doing justice to your view or your question. My translator stopped working, so this is, if I'm asked a question in Turkish, I'll need a.
Başka bir soru var mı arkadaşlar?
What's that? Oh, okay.
Göremiyorum ama el kaldırabilir mi arkadaşım? Tamam.
Ben sorumu Türkçe soracağım.
Çalışmıyor.
Tamam. Sor.
Sor sen sorunu.
Tamam. Bu güzel sunumunuz için çok teşekkür ediyorum. Benim sorum şu şekilde. Evren kendi kendisinin sebebi olamaz mı? Yani bu zaruri evrenin sebebi yine kendisi olamaz mıdır?
So first, she thanks to your presentation and she wants to ask, can universe cause itself?
Yes. I'm to tell you to let the interpreters interpret. I'm getting the interpretation. Oh, my power was dead on my hand. The battery went. Yeah. So okay, the question was,
Can universe cause itself?
Could the universe cause itself if it were just made out of this kind of stuff, the same kind of stuff as our cosmos, right? I think the picture that I was offering, which is like Spinoza's view, is that the sum total of all this physical stuff exists necessarily, not that it causes itself any more than that God would, if you believe in a necessarily existing God that causes everything else, you don't think typically that God causes God's own existence. God just exists necessarily. So the view that I was thinking of there, and would be Spinoza's view or David Lewis's view, which is there is all this stuff. On Spinoza's view, I think it's not a multiverse, it's just a cosmos. On Lewis's view, it's a multiverse. There's all this stuff, it just exists and it must exist. But it doesn't cause itself. Because I do think that is an incoherent notion. I don't think you can say the idea that the physical cosmos is necessary is implausible because it's a view that says the cosmos causes itself. I don't think you can really say that because, at least not if you defend the idea that God exists necessarily. Because then you do think something can exist necessarily, not cause itself.
Evet, teşekkür ederiz. Yarım saatlik bir çay kahve molası. Coffee break for half an hour.